Thom Woodroofe here from the Left Right think tank and Global Voices. I'll just begin by telling you a little bit about Thom. So Thom is, according to your website, 21 years old. You're a bit older now? 24 years old now. Is a foreign affairs analyst combining journalism, research, teaching and community work to advance an understanding of Australia's place in the world. Thom's going to answer a few questions for us today about his organisations and the various experiences he's had. So please join me in welcoming Thom to the CSE auditorium. Thanks for joining us, Thom.
Thank you.
So to begin with, I just wanted to ask you if you would tell us a little bit about yourself. So what brought you to politics and sparked your interest in social policy in particular?
I had quite an interesting upbringing for Australia. So I grew up on a small isolated property in Victoria, which somewhat strangely in a Western developed country had no electricity. But my parents weren't Amish or anything like that, but they enjoyed the isolation. So I think during that time, it instilled in me and in my brother and my sister quite a strong sense of sort of wanting to do things beyond the farm fence, so to speak. And then when I went to university at Monash, it really struck me that for anyone who's young who wanted to contribute to any policy topic beyond youth policy, which generally at that point is mostly conversations around skate parks and alco pops and cringeworthy stereotypical issues like that, there wasn't an outlet for them to do that. So if a young person who was studying foreign policy or who was studying economics wanted to be engaged in a conversation about that outside of the classroom, there wasn't an opportunity for them to do that. So in many ways I think my sort of passion for wanting to start Left Right many years ago was about trying to bridge that gap and create a space where young people can do that.
Thanks for explaining. So can you tell us a little bit about, firstly, the Left Right think tank? You established that in 2008, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so what was the process involved? How did you meet your co-founder, Rick Newenham, as well?
So Rick and I were good friends from another youth organisation that we were both involved in as teenagers, which somewhat blankly for everyone I was in the Air Force Cadets and Rick was in the Army Cadets, and we met through that. But as I said before, Left Right was designed to basically fill that gap of providing an opportunity for young people to have a voice outside of just youth issues. And being 18 at the time and having had really no experience in how to set up a national youth organisation, we embarked on trying to do that quite naively. We had no idea how hard it would be. We thought that if we had a good idea, that there would be people who would race to give us money. There was certainly a lot of young people that wanted to be involved, but we had no idea about the sort of legal implications of how to do that. We had, a good sense of what we wanted to do, but not necessarily the best sense of how to do it. We struggled with the kind of understanding of how to scale things up, so how to grow things once you get it going. But what we did have on our side was a lot of naivety, a lot of energy, and also I think it was quite an important period of time. So 2008 was the Obama year, which had quite a lot of effect in Australia. But it was also, I think, something that appealed to so many young people across the country because they were just sick of sort of left versus right partisan politics, and everyone kind of intrinsically or instinctively appealed to that opportunity to look at a policy issue or to look at an idea, but not look at it within the confines of what does the Labor Party think and what does the Liberal Party think. For a good year, so through all of 2008, we set about trying to establish this. And it wasn't until about 2 weeks before we committed to the public launch with the Chaser Boys that we actually even got our first funder. So it was quite a stressful time, but the tried and true business method of once you get your first funder, others flow was very much true. So snowballed from there.
It's a really great story. So obviously things have worked out and you did learn lessons along the way, and that's brought you to establish Global Voices.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that and how this project came about?
Yeah. So I left Right in September 2009. I moved overseas for about a year and a half. And when I came back, during that time overseas, I sort of shifted focus much more from sort of general policy or general ideas to what really interests me, which is foreign policies. And when I came back to Australia at the start of 2011, it struck me that one thing that was really missing in terms of opportunities for young people on the world stage was for young Australians to be able to attend sort of key international events that other young people from other countries were able to attend. So, for example, the G20 meeting, the APEC meeting, the United Nations, there was many countries around the world that had a structured program that allowed their young people to attend these, that funded them to do that, that designed it in such a way that they could actually have influence over these forums. But Australia just didn't have that. The government wasn't doing it, nor necessarily should the government do it, but they weren't doing it. And no other place was doing it. So what Global Voices sought to do, and still does, is that it brings together 24 different sponsors, most of which are universities around the country, and that therefore brings the dough. And then what we do is we then provide scholarships for any young Australian from 18 to 30 to then be able to attend those events completely free of charge. I've just left it, but we joked that it was better than winning a holiday, because not only, when you win a holiday, you can get your airfare and your hotel covered, but we'd pay airfare, we'd pay hotel, we'd pay the airport costs, we'd pay the visa costs, we'd take them to Canberra beforehand to meet the Prime Minister, all this sort of stuff. But it was all very much predicated on them developing an idea to then take to those forums. So there's no point doing a junket to go to the G20 if you've got nothing to say. So it was very much designed around them thinking of an idea to take to the G20 and then developing that before they went.
Would you be able to tell us a little bit about the various policies and ideas that a lot of the young people that you're involved with through Left Right and also through Global Voices, some of the things that they've brought to the table and introduced in their delegations overseas?
Yeah, absolutely. Left Right's theory of sort of change from a policy perspective is effectively called a fellowships program. So you get a bunch of young people together in each state, and then they, for a 6-month period of time, collectively work on an issue that's of mutual interest to them, and they engage with different stakeholders along the way, and then at the end of that they produce a sort of policy document or an ideas document. And all the while trying to do that without trying to sort of buy into the usual debate on policies. They look for ideas that are sort of overlooked, or that don't necessarily look at the issue the same way as the parties. So one of the ones that was most successful in Left Right was they looked at how does, it's not very sexy, but how do universities effectively fund innovation research, and how you can restructure that using a more voucher mentality to basically incentivize that. But Global Voices, they look at generally very specific issues for a particular forum and in quite some detail. So they've looked at, for example, the fact that within the issue of climate change, there's no definition legally of a climate change refugee. So someone who becomes a refugee not because they're fleeing from war, or not because they're fleeing from political persecution, or they're not an economic migrant. It's someone who's forced to leave their homeland because they no longer exist because of climate change. So, for example, we've sent delegates to the UN, international UN climate negotiations. Our delegates look at that very issues. They're often very specific to those types of forums, but also very focused on injecting a new idea and not just analysing the status quo.
It's really great to hear. So if we're talking about what young people can do to get involved as change makers within their communities or on the global scale, what kind of suggestions do you have for young people, such as students here at UOW? How would you suggest that they get involved in politics or leadership, or just making change within their own communities?
That's a tough question. I think from my own experience, I think the thing that I've learned the most is that you've really got to seek out things if you want. You can't be complacent and expect, your university or school or whoever to bring those things. You really got to seek them out. But also that there's an incredible amount out there when you do go looking, an incredible amount out there that is very, very valuable to what to do. So I think something that I learned very, very early on, as an undergraduate student, I was a terrible student. I was never there. In my year 12 year, I missed half of the year. I changed quite a bit as a postgraduate student, but as an undergrad, I was terrible. But what I think I learned most was that, you can sit in a classroom and learn something, or you can try and engage that issue outside the classroom. And in many ways, as long as you're doing both, you're mutually benefiting both aspects. So, if you want to be involved in whatever issue, perhaps with the exception of medical students, you don't have to go to every class to be the most engaged in that issue. You should look for ways to be engaged in that issue outside of university, and that will then bring that back to university. You'll probably get good grades and that sort of stuff. So I think, seek them out, don't expect them to come to you. Be ambitious, be audacious, ask people for funding. There's a lot of funding out there if you're willing to, if you can get yourself, accepted into something or invited to do something, or there's a value in you doing it, including from your university. You should never be afraid to ask. So I think those are probably the key factors, but obviously differs for each person what their particular interests are.
So something that comes to mind now, you're speaking about how there are so many opportunities available for people. Within my own experience, I definitely see that. Something that I often wonder about though is, how can we differentiate a good opportunity, something that's ethical, from something that might actually be harmful if we're involved in it, or it could actually not give us the kind of skills and benefits that we're hoping for? How do people negotiate what is a good choice and a bad choice in terms of what to get involved in?
So what's an unethical one?
In my opinion, I know people who have gone and volunteered, for example, in orphanages in Cambodia. But a lot of the children that are there, they might be there because their parents have actually been paid off to give the children over, and the children are used as kind of a cash incentive to take money out of tourists who then come and spend a small amount of time with the children, but it's actually detrimental to the children's development.
Okay. I think probably for me to answer that question really lays in the balance between what you're doing, what the outcome of what you're doing is, so the collective outcome, and then secondly, particularly for people in RA, what is the benefit that you're getting personally from doing it, right? So, to take the orphanage example, I think too many people around the world of any age think that, if they've got $3,000, the best way maybe to spend that $3,000 is to, fly to Cambodia and volunteer in an orphanage for 2 months. And in many ways, that $3,000 might have been better spent just giving the orphanage $3,000 to hire someone at half the cost who doesn't need to fly internationally to do the very same work and probably do it better than just less people language. So, there's the value there to the orphanage, pretty low, unless you become some sort of advocate for them or whatever. But the value to you personally is very, very high from doing something like that, because you're in a different culture, you're learning very different skill sets, you're being challenged and all that sort of stuff. So I think the value or the dimension that's at play in this sort of stuff is thinking about the balance between what's the benefit that you're contributing to, what's the wider cause, and then secondly, the selfish argument. Never be afraid to be selfish and think, well, what's the personal benefit in me doing this? So, I'm probably the first to admit that there's things that I've done and there's things that other young people do that are CV fillers. They do that because it maybe was from their CV or because there was a personal benefit in them doing it, but not because there was a particularly wider benefit to doing it at all. And that's important if it's at the right stage of life and it's going to help you get to something else, or you're going to learn something that's critical from it. So you should, I think, always be conscious of where that balance sits.
So you've had many different experiences, clearly since you were in high school and then up to this point now. I was reading a little bit about you, and I've trolled your website. So I want to know a bit about your work as a freelance journalist. You've been to places like Burma, Cuba and the West Bank.
Yeah.
What sparked your interest in going there, reporting on the issues that people in these places were facing?
So I've never done any journalism training, I've never done any media training, and I quite ambitiously woke up one day and said I'm going to write an opinion piece for the Age. And I've never written a news article. I don't, if there's any journalist students listening or hate it, but I think to me, writing an article you're told to write is very little appeal. The appeal is to be able to write an article that has your opinion in it, that's ideas focused and so forth. So, since then I've been very lucky to be able to contribute regularly to pieces on different foreign policy topics primarily. And I think the thing that I've always tried to do, which has then led to being able to go to these sort of places, is looking for particularly stories that I think are overlooked, and particularly looking at trying to write a story about an issue in a way that engages a wider audience. So most people that would pick up the Daily Telegraph, there's a particular reason that the civil war in Syria is not on the front page, but it's on page 30, behind Angelina Jolie's trip to Tamworth, for example, right? And the reason that is because most of them go, war, blood, guns, money, it's all the same, and there's always going to be a page 30 story on death and destruction. And then they don't kind of tend to engage with it much and try and understand why that is. And most foreign policy issues, I think, are actually incredibly straightforward. They're really about, as Tony Abbott would say, goodies versus baddies, or about something else that's quite simple. And it's actually, if you delve into things, and Civil War is not necessarily the best example, but often things are quite interesting. They're sometimes and often quite hilarious. For example, why is Dennis Rodman back in North Korea? Things like that. So I've always, I think, tried to write those pieces as well with that frame of mind of you've got to get a wider audience to read what you're trying to write, because through doing that you can engage a wider audience in a really interesting topic and make it interesting to them, rather than simply just writing the sort of news and events of the day. So I've been lucky to be able to go to those places. That wasn't directly for that, but then I wrote from that. But also just the sort of natural curiosity to travel is one thing. So I'm actually going back to the West Bank next week. Always, I think when you're also in a foreign environment as well, you inevitably sort of think about an issue and then you formulate a topic in your mind and that sort of stuff. So, writing something, as I say, I never had any training in, I never had any experience with it at all, but I think it's a great outlet for anyone, because at the end of the day, the person reading the newspaper doesn't see the photo of the 24 or 21 or 21-year-old. They just see the name and they don't know it's about the writing. So you hide behind the writing. And anyone can write for the newspaper. Anyone can write for the Sydney Morning Herald, or anyone can write for the Daily Telegraph if you'd want to. It's just about thinking about something that's different that they're not covering and having ideas around it.
If anyone can write for the various newspapers, what are your tips for how to go about doing this?
So putting aside how to get in it, I think probably the three things that make a really good opinion piece. And number one, opinion. You've got to have an opinion. I've read a lot. Sometimes mine aren't necessarily opinion focused. To get too into the kind of play-by-play and not necessarily the argument of what you think should happen. So you've definitely got to have an idea or a different angle to what's being covered that you want to get out there. The second is it's got to be the right time. So there's no point writing about, why the Cold War was really a great conspiracy of, New Zealand when, the Cold War was 20-something years ago, right? You've got to be writing something that's current in the news cycle right now and have something different to say about it. And the third is you've got to make an argument why you're the person to be saying that. So that's often the hardest, I think, for young people as well. So, the fact you're studying it is one thing, and some people that'll be enough. But more ideally, you've got to sort of have done something or experienced something relative to it. So maybe you've attended a conference where that was discussed, or, have just visited there, and even if it was just on holiday. So something that kind of establishes why you've got the credibility to say that, and that's admittedly very tough. But all the newspapers, the ABC and so forth, they all accept submissions from anyone. So, I think if you email opinion@smh.com.au, for example, it goes to the opinion editor. But really, they're quite competitive, and you've got to try and develop a bit of a name for yourself. But if you've got a cracker of a piece and a cracker of an argument, then you'll often be able to get it in if you push quite a lot. You follow it up. You're ambitiously sort of naive and a bit rude in following it up, because you can play off the fact you're young and eager. But the ABC is a very good one that's often open to publishing first timers as well. So I've always thought if there's anyone out there that has an idea, there's really nothing stopping you writing it. There's quite a lot of times at university as well. I would turn an essay into an article. And that helped me write the essay, because then I thought, I'm getting paid to write this, rather than just writing it for university. The trick there is just got to make sure it gets published after you write it, so it doesn't show up in the, the plagiarism check thing, and then it creates a very awkward moment with your professor trying to explain why you've written that. But it's a great way to actually make a buck as well if you're a young person. And it's often, I think, a lot easier to do than people think. So, if you write a cracker of an essay, it's full of opinion, you've got ideas, you develop them well, then why not have a shot at getting that published?
Some really great advice, yeah. So let's talk about the evolution of Thom.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit?
Sounds awfully biological.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you studied during your time at university, being overseas throughout your studies?
Yeah.
And how did that bring you to the point that you're at now? What are you looking to do?
All throughout my teenagehood, I wanted to be a fighter pilot in the Air Force, and I very quickly gave up on that idea. And then, as all washed-out fighter pilots do, I went and studied arts at Monash University. But the good thing was that my degree was a new degree called Arts Global, Global, which makes it, of course, much, much sexier than an arts degree. But it didn't, the only key difference was that it was required that you studied overseas. After a year and a half at Monash, I went over to the US and I lived there for a year and studied there, which was actually great. It was fantastic, and I worked there. I had the great opportunity for working for Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor of California. But then I just got hooked on studying overseas. So then I spent the rest of my degree on exchange. So I went to Switzerland, Turkey and Italy for short-term programs, and then I did my last semester at Monash, at Malaysia, where Monash University has a campus. But the thing, there's a lot of advantages to going on exchange. I think one is that it's only pass-fail. So that's always a good thing. So it doesn't affect your transcript generally. But the other is that you just learn so much more, I think, by being, as I said earlier, by being in that different environment rather than necessarily what you're learning in the classroom. And you get all sorts of different opportunities, like I did, that are not necessarily possible in Australia at that age, and because you're an Australian. I adored it, is the simplest way of putting it. But I've no doubt that the difference of views that you got, for example, studying international relations in Australia was very, very different from the views of international relations that I got in the United States, which is very, very different to the views in international relations I then got in Malaysia. So there's also quite a strong academic for doing it as well. But I'd encourage anyone to do it. And the final point I'd make on that, though, is just that I was a poor student at the time. As I said, I grew up without electricity. I certainly did not have enough money to go and do 2.5 years studying overseas. But there is actually quite a lot of grants out there, both from your university but also from the government, to be able to do that. So, if you're struggling to get by, don't write off the possibility of studying overseas because of that. Because often it's actually, it's doable financially to be able to go on exchange. So I think that's great. So anyway, I did that, and then I did what all Monash students do after some time at Monash, and I defected to Melbourne University, where I did my honours degree and then did a master's degree. So that's the playbook of study.
Would you be able to tell us a little bit about your master's research?
Yeah, sure. So I looked at Australia's Security Council campaign, UN Security Council campaign, which at the time nobody was really talking about. And then obviously in the last year when we won, and then this year where we're actually on the Security Council, and this month when we're actually president of the Security Council, everyone's kind of talking about it. But no, it was great. So I basically looked at what do you need to do to win a seat on the Security Council. Particularly, I was interested in looking at that, not necessarily for how Australia could win, but more so for how small countries in the world could win. So how could a country like, for example, Bhutan, that ran for the council last year, and small countries in the world, developing countries in the world, are often the most affected by the issues that are discussed on the Security Council, are exactly the ones that are often left out of the room when they talk about them. So I wanted to kind of look at methodically what are the strategies that countries employ to basically get elected, from what are the deals that are done. And there are very, very funny deals, like for example the Greeks about 10 years ago took all of the UN ambassadors to the Greek islands for a week with their wives to basically encourage them to vote for Greece. So it's quite a corrupt process as well. But look at all of those sort of strategies and break it down into the quite simple steps. So it was good. So I really enjoyed doing that, and it was sort of a right time to do it. But then when I finished it, it was such an interesting time because the campaign was then getting very intense. As I said, not many people were actually focused on it at the time. So it was a great springboard to then launch that sort of wider. So I did a lot of writing from that. I did a bit of speaking. I did a bit of consulting on it. So there's great opportunities as well to do what you do in the classroom and take it wider. So I never wanted my thesis to be, on a professor's bookshelf and that for that to be it. So I always made sure that I tried to take it as wide as possible. And also in the strategy of research. So I interviewed the PM, 3 former foreign ministers. I got to go to New York and Norway for the research. So, there's lots and lots of... You should never be bound by what you think are the expectations of your professor or your university when looking at something. If you want to look at, Australia's engagement in Cambodia, then go and interview the Cambodian Prime Minister if you can. And often you'll find these people are very, very open to giving you 15 minutes if they know that what you're writing is going to be a quality product. So... but I think too many people just go, oh no, I could never possibly do that, or who would I contact, or whatever that is. But in many ways it's quite easy to kind of get that stuff if you've got a reason to do it.
Would you say that many young people set limits for themselves that are unreasonable?
Yeah, but I think in the negative sense. So I think too many young people will kind of say to themselves, and it kind of sounds a bit arrogant for me to say it as a young person myself, but we kind of say to themselves, well look, I could never do that, or that's never going to be a possibility, or that's just not done, or whatever. Whereas in fact, you should never be afraid to be, a bit arrogant. You should never be afraid to be sort of ambitiously naive, to try and smash through things like a bit of a bull in a china shop. And the reality is that as being a young person, it's actually a great trick to be able to get away with that stuff. Because people will just go, oh Sarah, you're a young person, that's just how you are, right? And they'll kind of, it's culturally accepted to be a bit ambitious when you're young, whereas when you get a bit older, it's, you've got to be professional about everything, all this sort of stuff. So I think if anything, a lot of young people just tend to kind of not, they certainly have the ideas and they see them, they just don't tend to seize them. And I think you see that particularly in ideas they have around projects. So, the thing with left-right, and if we did left-right again, I'm not sure we would have even done it, knowing how hard it was. But the thing is that we kind of thought it would be easy and therefore took the next step. Whereas I think a lot of people think, oh, it's too hard, or they don't know where to start, so they never take that next step. And just because you don't know where to start, and we had no idea where to start, you've just got to get started and do something. Taking that first step's the hardest, but you should always do it.
Some great advice to hear. So you've met some really interesting and inspiring people over the years. Is there anyone who's left a particularly profound impact?
You mean outside of sort of personal life, like bigger people?
we could talk personal and the wider world. You could maybe give us two people then. Somebody on a more personal level and somebody on a more professional level.
Yeah, right. I think, personally, I think my greatest influence was my grandfather. He was, a colonial service diplomat in the British government. He was someone who was very generous. He worked in Nigeria for 17 years. My father and his two brothers were born there. But he had a very strong sense of sort of, ironically working for the colonial service, which was sort of the bastions of, brutality across the developing world. But he had a very strong sense of sort of what, how the developing countries often get a bit of an unfair go, and how it's best that as a Westerner, for example, you can best help them behind the scenes. Sort of bigger than that, I'm not sure who the most inspiring person I've met is. I've got a bit of a Hillary crush, so that was pretty cool. Be her in turn. I don't know. I think one of the things I admired from working in Arnold Schwarzenegger's office when he was governor of California, and I'd stress it was pre-Maidgate, so I think a lot of people lost a lot of respect for him over that. But I think one of the things that made him very, very successful as a politician, and one of the things I enjoyed through working, nearby to him, was that he was never afraid to not be, who he was. So he was obviously an actor, bodybuilder turned actor turned politician. But he would use that to his advantage rather than run away from it. So, there's time that he was flying up to reopen a dam that had been repopulated with fish that had been poisoned. And, a story like that would sort of not get any media coverage, right? The local, Whoop Whoop Times would cover it, and nothing else, nothing else. So it was really just a sort of local announcement. So the office prepared him lots and lots of interesting, insightful speaking remarks about fish, and I'm sure it was the most interesting work they'd ever done. But I remember he said to them, "Look, don't worry, I know what I'm going to say, it's okay, it's fine, blah, blah, blah." And everyone obviously got quite worried when they knew that he knew what he wanted to say, because they had no idea what he wanted to say. So he went up and he opened the press conference about opening this dam full of fish again. And he said, "I've got one thing to say to you all, and it's the fish will be back." And suddenly, a line like that not only runs in the Whoop Whoop Times, but it runs on Letterman, it runs on international media that day. So he gets what is a local issue and delivers him votes. He got it out to a much broader audience. So it's quite crafty. So I quite liked how he was never afraid to walk away from who he was whilst reinventing himself as a politician.
Along the way. Can you think of any particular lessons that you'd like to share with our audience today? Something that has stuck in your memory, or a particular experience that you'd like to share with us that might be motivating or inspiring to our students here at UOW?
That's a tough question. I think two things, probably quite cliched. One is what I was saying earlier. If you've got an idea or you want to do something, just do it. Don't really worry about what people will think of it. Don't really worry about how necessarily to do it. Just try and do it. Just think of how you could try and do it, and just do it, even if it's not the right way. And in many ways, even if you do something and it fails, and you never get the interview, or you never get the project off the ground, you're going to learn a lot just by having done that. And we've all done things that don't work out. I think the second is probably to have a very strong, compass in life about what you want to do, or not necessarily what you want to do, but what are the values that underpin why you want to do that. So I have absolutely no idea what I want to do in life. Absolutely no idea. But what I know, in terms of jobs and all that sort of stuff. But what I know is that I'd like to try and change, for example, the way that people view Australian foreign policy. Whereas, so I think at the moment it's very interest-based, it's very economically focused about who do we sell our resources to and who provides our national security guarantee, and not necessarily about what are the values as a country that we should be standing up for. So, for example, if we don't believe in the death penalty in Australia, then should we be standing up for that value on the world stage? We've got 14 countries in the Pacific who are all developing countries right on our doorstep. 22 of 24 of our nearest neighbours are from the developing world. Do we actually behave as a sort of advocate for their interests on the world stage? Not at all. Do we see ourselves inserting ourselves into debates, for example, among other countries that don't necessarily have a relevance to us, but where we could probably play a constructive role? Not really. We tend to sort of shy away from responsibility. I think if you have that kind of moral or value-based underpinning to what you want to do, or the abstract concept of what you want to do, then that's sort of, in many ways, more important than the job that would let you to do that. And in many ways, that's just sort of like the train or the car or whatever. As long as you know the destination, then how you get there doesn't really matter. So I think, everyone gets confused, and I'm confused about what job to do all that, but if you have a frame of mind about what it is in the abstract you want to do, then I think that's important. But who knows? I can't give life lessons at my age.
I'm going to go into a trickier question then.
Okay.
You just spoke about values and having a good moral compass.
Yeah.
What do you value?
I think I value, it's probably, if I had to say what I think are the three values that I would like to think I stand up for, and whether I do is completely another question. I would like to think they're probably equality, opportunity and justice, and I'd like to think that I enthuse that through the work I'm doing now in terms of being passionate about the interests of developing countries on the world stage, through trying to increase their voice, through trying to increase the voices of others, such as young people on the world stage, young people on the domestic stage. But then also equality, I think, just as a product of my upbringing. So, I was bullied quite a lot at high school. I think that forged in me quite a strong sense of not being able to understand how others could sort of stand by and let things happen that they didn't necessarily believe in, but they just sort of stood by. And that, that's a bit of a cliche, but I think it framed in me quite a strong sense of, if you believe in something, it's about actually doing something about it and standing up for that when you see that happen, and not just sort of saying that you believe in something. So I think they're probably the values that I'd like to think I stand up for, but whether I do is probably another thing.
Thanks very much for sharing that. So we have 15 minutes left. I would like to open up for questions from you guys. Do you have anything that you would like to ask Thom?
I'm just wondering, so on your Twitter feed at the moment, it's just like a sea of reposts and posts about the Pacific Islands.
It's a very good reason.
I guess that's your focus at the moment. So what's your ultimate goal? What's your project, I guess, to do with the Pacific Islands?
It's very timely. So I just got back from the Pacific yesterday. So I work in a role now with a group, with an international diplomatic advisory firm, which assists small countries in the world with basically elevating their voice on the world stage. And one of the countries that we've been working with is the host of the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the leaders' meeting of the 14 Pacific Island countries in Australia and New Zealand, which took place last week in the Marshall Islands. So I've been in the Marshall Islands now for the last 2.5 weeks. One of the things that they were trying to do as host was they proposed a declaration on climate leadership, which was basically, the Marshall Islands its highest point is 10 metres above sea level. It's mostly 2 metres above sea level. It's a coral atoll country, one of only 4 in the world. It's right on the front lines of climate change. They're building seawalls around their homes. It's a very lived reality for them right now. But how much they can do about it as a small country in the world is obviously limited unless they seek to bring people together. So what they tried to do with the forum last week was effectively say to everyone, look, what we're doing is not enough. Here we are in the capital of our country, which has been affected by climate change. we want to propose a declaration that effectively says to everyone we need more leadership on this. That does that through basically the incentive of saying to people, you need to act now and not wait for others to act. But also does it in quite a creative way, which doesn't just ask governments to do it, but asks companies to do it, and asks cities to do it, and others. So, I mean, that's why it's so Pacific Islands heavy, is because I've been there and just focused pretty much entirely on that for the last 3 weeks. But as I said earlier, you know, my broader interest there is that I think that Australia, with the Pacific right next door, just doesn't pay any attention whatsoever to that region. And we should. You know, New Zealand does a better job. Not a great job, but a better job. But you know, it's incredible to think actually that Australia has such a close proximity and really such a close relationship to these countries, but really doesn't tend to sort of appreciate that or value that much. And I think you see that in Australian people as well. You know, Australian people go to Fiji or Vanuatu or New Caledonia and check into a resort, and that's about their engagement with the Pacific. So I think it's something that definitely needs to change, and it was a good experience the last 3 weeks to be there. And what they did was they reconfirmed their emissions reduction targets, so their targets to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases, which is actually quite a big step, because it's not clear whether the now government in Australia, the incoming government in Australia, actually was going to basically reiterate those commitments. So that was quite a big step. But I think what it did the most was that it put a lived reality on it, as I said, but it also showed Australia and New Zealand that, you know, the countries of the Pacific Islands might be small, but in many ways they're also leading the fight against climate change. And I mean that not just in the diplomatic sense, but in their transition to renewable energy. So if you look at, I think Tonga, New Caledonia and a couple of others, they've got 100% renewable targets by 2050. You know, and Australia's is 20% by 2020. You know, so they're absolutely leading the world in terms of adaptation to, or, you know, mitigation of climate change. So, you know, the Marshall Islands, for example, it's 1,000 islands scattered across thousands of kilometres of the Pacific Ocean. You know, the capital is about 300 metres wide and a 40-kilometre string of one island, right? But this country has installed solar panels on 70% of those islands, right? So they're completely powered by solar power. You know, and then you look at Australia, and Australia's got a much easier ability to do that, and it's certainly got the money to be able to do that, but it doesn't do that. So I think the other thing that the meeting did, was that it sort of demonstrated that there is a real both benefit to doing that, but also that the rest of the world, and particularly those that have often the least capacity but the most impact from it, are actually doing it as well.
Okay, do we have questions from anybody else? Yes? Yeah.
Obviously you, and I think you said you're going to the West Bank again next week, was it? So obviously you've been focusing on the Pacific Islands at the moment, but considering your real research in Australia's role, and especially, sorry, I don't know if you can hear me, Australia's role in the UN Security Council and so on, and your interest in the area, I was wondering, first of all, what you think about the situation in Syria and what actually is practical that the UN can do. And secondly as well, there was a lot of cynicism, at least from a lot of my friends, in the election campaign, especially over Australia's reaction to Syria, and what, I suppose, how effective they were questioning what Kevin Rudd or Tony Abbott were going to do in that sort of situation, especially as president of the Security Council now.
Yeah. So, look, the first thing I'd say is that I think in the election campaign, Syria was deliberately put into play by the Labor Party as a bit of a political tool. You might recall in the 2008 presidential election in the US, Hillary Clinton did an ad, Hillary Clinton did an ad that effectively said, it was an ad that was of the middle of the night, it was in a house, there were children sleeping, and the phone rang, and it said, who do you want to answer the phone at 3 a.m. if there's a national security crisis? And the clear message was it should be Hillary Clinton, who was experienced, and not the inexperienced Barack Obama. And what that did was she basically said, I'm better at national security. And look, I think that Rudd Rudd was careful about how he did it, and there was obviously a very, very important sort of reason as well why he should talk about it. But I would bet he was absolutely conscious that national security was a winning argument for him, and not a winning argument necessarily for Tony Abbott, who doesn't have the foreign policy experience that he does. So I think that's the first point. There was definitely some politics around it. Second point is, so the Labor Party's idea was that the government should make a statement in the Security Council, what's called a presidential statement. So as chair, you have the prerogative to basically make a speech, as weak as that sounds, about something. What they don't understand is that speech, even though Australia makes it, actually is done via consensus with everyone else in the council. So really, I mean, it was a nice thing to suggest, but actually wasn't grounded in the pragmatic reality of how the Security Council operates. On the flip side, it was interesting. Tony Abbott's line, I think, is not nuanced enough that it will need to be as Prime Minister and as President of the Security Council. So he said, in Syria it's a war between baddies and baddies, and the Syrian opposition is a complex group, no doubt about it, very, very complex group, but they are not all bad elements. And the second thing he did was he said, look, I don't necessarily endorse what the US is saying, that there should be something done about it, but I instinctively support what the US does, right? Which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think as Prime Minister you would see, and you would probably expect that Tony Abbott will have to be a bit more nuanced about that. It'll be interesting to see what he does actually suggest is the Australian government's position on Syria. In terms of the broader issue though about it, it's abhorrent, the amount of, a million children have now been refugees. I think there's been, hundreds of thousands of people killed. It is an intensely complex political issue though, in the region in particular. I'm not sure how you do something about it. I think that Obama was probably pretty conscious of the reality that it would never get supported in the Congress. So when the vote takes place today or tomorrow, it won't win. It'll be defeated. There's no doubt about that. And I think Obama knew that from the start. And the reason he did it is that he could say, well, look, I tried my best, but the Congress said no, right? Which is exactly what happened in the United Kingdom. But what was interesting was the Russians overnight proposed this plan where the international community would effectively take charge of the Syrian government's stockpiles of chemical weapons, and I think that was probably a fallback for Obama, and one he'll seize very enthusiastically as a sort of, I'm doing something, whereas in reality he doesn't have to bomb anything and he doesn't have to do anything much more than that. If he does go in, it's no doubt it'll be a limited operation. He'll take out a few military control towers and, aim for maximum impact and minimum casualties, and that'll be it. And then really it'll be what the Syrians do about it. And I doubt they'll do anything, because they'll realise if they do, then it escalates it and they don't want to escalate it. What do you do about it? I have no idea really. But I think the critical issue is Russia. And I think the Russians have got to be convinced that it's in their interest to do something. I think the stuff they proposed last night helps. There's no doubt that they see Syria not necessarily as a moral argument around intervention. They see Syria as basically one of the last bastions of their support in the world, unwavering support in the world. They've got a military base there. It's their only military base outside of the former Soviet Union. So, one way that you might be able to do that is by trying to encourage direct talks between the Syrian opposition and the Russians. So, for example, if the guarantee was made that the Russians could keep their military base, even if the government in Syria changed, then that might help, for example. But I think you've got to put the focus on the Russians. The Chinese will follow whatever the Russians do. They're not invested. They're just doing it out of a principled line of, we don't support intervention. But if they're by themselves, the Chinese don't stop things. So it's all about the Russians.
Okay, do we have any final questions?
I'm just wondering, you said that you're not involved with local voices anymore.
Yeah.
You're well aware that if your uni doesn't have a partnership with local voices, that it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
To go to play like the two places, perhaps, out of the delegation.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how you and not going to go about securing sponsorship.
Yeah, no, great question. I'm really glad you raised it. So, look, when I was in charge of GB, it was always the thing that I hated the most was that we didn't have 100% national scholarships. The business case around that is it's just not viable, right? Where would we get the money from if the university didn't see the direct benefit? I always thought the best model was that you create enough scholarships that you don't dilute your business model, but that you have an opportunity for anyone to do it. And I was frankly disappointed that in 2.5 years I think we did 5 scholarship places and we did 84 university places. Massive, disconnect. 2 things about that though. One is that I'm pretty sure UOW is now a sponsor. It might only be for one place, but I'm pretty sure it is. The second is that that will change. It's just a matter of when. But it's certainly something they're very conscious of, and it's something that they're hoping to change. And even if it's just that it's one place is open per delegation, then at least that would mean that anyone can apply for any of its delegations. But as I say, really it was a matter of, how do we make something from a business case viable to get off the ground, while also being equitable. And, there's no doubt that we got a lot of criticism for it as well. And we used to always say to those people, well, think about it from our perspective. If we didn't do it, no one would. So the 84 university students wouldn't get anything at all. So what we're doing is good, but we certainly need to adapt to be more open. And it'll happen. It's just a matter of time.
Is there any students that we can campaign our university?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sorry, you did mention that. Yeah, absolutely. The best way to probably do that is for you to get in touch with GV directly, and what they can do is they will set you up with some of their sort of sponsorship detail, which is not public, obviously. And then generally the best way to do it is then to find the right person on campus who you think would support it. So generally, Global Voices is supported at a few different levels. So sometimes the Vice Chancellor or someone in their office will say, let's do this. In which case, generally any student in the university can apply. Sometimes it's done through leadership programs, like this one, I think. So sometimes if you're in a leadership program, it's a really good idea to raise it with, the convener of that program. And the third way is generally as a faculty. So if you're in the arts faculty or if you're in the medical faculty or whatever, going to your dean or your director of students or whatever, and all their emails are always on their websites, and there's nothing wrong with being outgoing about doing that. And I must admit, if that happens and GV is copied in, then it makes us a lot more stronger in terms of being able to actually pursue that than if we do it ourselves, which 90% of the time it's us contacting the university ourselves. So, absolutely more effective. And if you want, please email me and I'll email you the